As I strolled along the deserted sidewalk in the rain, I zipped up my jacket in a feeble attempt to keep the chill away. I quickened my pace, eager to get home. The day felt much longer than usual. I worked at McDonald's, and I'm sure anyone who has worked in the food business most likely understands the feeling. It had been a shift of nothing but frustration, and I was grateful that it was finally over. My shoes scuffed against the pavement, echoing as I rounded the desolate corner up ahead. Streetlights illuminated my path as I weaved through the desolate neighborhood. Between the rain and the darkness of the night, it definitely felt eerie, to say the least. Suddenly, after walking with my head down, trying not to trip in the darkness, I looked up and saw that a figure appeared from the shadows, coming from the opposite direction. My heart immediately began to thud. It took me a moment to comprehend what I was seeing. He looked like a cop, wearing a navy blue security uniform with a holstered gun attached to his belt. Despite the reassuring appearance, something about him felt unsettling. Perhaps the way his eyes seemed to lock onto me that made me feel uneasy. After seeing me, he stood still and silent, not saying a word. I turned my gaze away, fumbling for my phone in mine. No one was around, and I felt extremely vulnerable. I had the urge to run, but it felt like my feet were glued to the ground. I slowly began to back away, inching closer and closer to the edge of the sidewalk. Suddenly, my phone lit up, displaying a text message from my friend. I looked back at the figure and immediately saw that he had moved closer, now standing directly in front of me. His presence seemed to dwarf my own. We held each other's gaze, and I felt like I had stepped into an alternate reality. Time seemed to move in slow motion. As I stood there with my heart still pounding in my chest, he looked ready to make a move, and I panicked. That's when it hit me. I remembered hearing the mayor make an announcement, warning everyone that there has been an increased amount of human trafficking in the area. Everything else suddenly felt insignificant. My job, my problems, my life. All of it was irrelevant in that moment. I felt like the only thing that mattered was surviving this horrific encounter. As I started to back away, he began to speak. His words were like daggers, piercing through my skin and rattling my bones. "You shouldn't be out here," he said, not taking his eyes off of me. I couldn't move. I didn't know what to make of it. Was this some kind of trick? His words echoed in my head, and my mind was spinning as I desperately tried to make sense of the situation. The shadow of his figure grew larger, and my body froze in fear. I felt powerless. I had to try something. As I tried to come up with an escape plan, he reached into his pocket to grab something. Instantly, I stepped back in horror, prepared to run. But then something unexpected happened. He pulled out a badge and flashed it in front of my face. It was a police officer. He spoke again, telling me that he'd been patrolling the area to investigate the high rate of human trafficking in the area. He had spotted me and thought I might be in danger. I was relieved, though visibly shaken. I thanked him profusely, and he offered to drive me home, pointing to his parked car up ahead. He added that it was part of his job to ensure that everyone was kept safe. As my heart was still racing from the initial scare, I got into his car and he drove me home. Part of me was still worried, but I had a newfound sense of relief since he seemed like a pretty nice guy. Everything about him seemed to check out. The inside of the car looked just like a police car, and he was communicating with someone on the radio. As I arrived home, the rain had started to pour, and the police officer assured me he'd patrolled the area regularly. I thanked him once more and got out of the car. I had finally made it home, safe and sound, or so I thought. As I stood in front of my house, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced over my shoulder, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary, so I shrugged it off. I thought about the police officer and how he had saved me from an uncertain fate. And then it hit me. What if he somehow wasn't a real police officer? He had intimidated me into getting into his car, and he had somehow been watching me all along without me knowing. That's when I realized I could be in grave danger. I quickly ran inside, shutting my door behind me as I peered out the window. It looked like the car was gone, but that wasn't enough to calm my nerves. After some contemplation, I decided to call the non-emergency police line and ask them to confirm that an officer drove me home. Hearing their response literally made me drop to the floor. None of the officers gave me a ride home. Now, realizing I had been driven home by a stranger claiming to be a cop, I filed a police report. I'm still left with so many unanswered questions. He easily could have taken me when I got into his car. The events of that night still deeply disturbed me, even though it happened 3 months ago. The police have no leads, and that person is still out there. I just pray that he doesn't come back. Exercise has always been something I've maintained in my life. However, that changed drastically when I became a mother of 3 kids. My life turned into a whirlwind of chaos, balancing my regular job with the demanding role of being a mother. The result was little to no free time for anything else. Then 2 months ago, a significant milestone arrived. 1 year had passed since I gave birth to my last child. On that day, I made a crucial decision. Despite my hectic schedule, I committed to gradually reintroducing regular exercise into my life. My goal was simple: to walk every day for the next year, even if it was just a short stroll. Little did I know how challenging it would be. With my schedule packed, my only available time for exercise was late at night, after I put the kids to bed. Instead of spending that time watching TV before collapsing into sleep, I chose to supplement it with nightly walks. The initial weeks were tough, battling single-digit temperatures and biting winds that made it feel even colder. But I remained dedicated. As I ventured down my well-known route, the occasional Christmas lights still hanging on houses helped distract me from the cold. The path led me to a dead end near a ditch, which stretched ahead for a quarter mile. Crossing the street and walking on the other side, which bordered the highway, involved navigating through about 30 yards of woods. A small strip of grass before the woods made for a pleasant path, but it also triggered occasional unease, as I worried something might lurk there. Nevertheless, I pressed on, convinced nothing would happen. On one chilly Thursday night, as I walked along the grassy path, I noticed an animal staring at me. Initially, I thought it might be a raccoon or a groundhog, but as I drew closer, I realized it was a dog. The poor creature was shivering, but allowed me to approach and speak soothingly to it. As I got within a few feet, I recognized the dog from a house up the road, where I had often seen it in the mornings when I drove to work. It had no collar, leading me to believe it had slipped its chain. I was relieved to have found it, knowing it wouldn't have survived much longer in such harsh weather. Gradually, the dog warmed up to me, allowing me to pick it up, and I started carrying it home. Upon arriving back at my house, I was struck by the sight of all the lights blazing in the living room. I rang the doorbell repeatedly, but there was no response. Though I had never met the homeowners, I knew their 2 familiar cars were in the driveway, indicating they were home. The situation seemed bizarre, and I was puzzled by their lack of concern for their missing dog. Feeling helpless, I decided to call the police and request a welfare check on the house. When the police arrived, both the dog and I were frozen, prompting the officer to allow us inside his cruiser. While the officers knocked on the front door, their repeated attempts went unanswered, stirring a growing sense of worry within me. I wondered if something terrible had occurred inside that house. The officer informed me that I should return home since they needed to enter the house. He kindly offered me a ride, noticing the beginnings of frostbite on my nose. Gratefully, I accepted, but asked if I could keep the dog to prevent it from being sent to the pound. Back home, I focused on warming up the dog and feeding it. Despite the strange events of the night, I found myself surprisingly alert. However, my tranquility was abruptly shattered when I heard a gunshot while watching TV. My immediate thought turned to the police at the nearby house. A whirlwind of thoughts overwhelmed me, and I knew I had to investigate. I placed the dog in my car and drove back to the scene. attempting to discreetly observe the unfolding events. As I approached the house, my heart sank. Two people were being wheeled out on stretchers, each covered with a white blanket. To my shock, a third body followed. I watched in disbelief as an EMT wheeled them into an ambulance. Overwhelmed and shaken, I knew I had seen enough. I turned my car around and headed home. To this day, I remain in the dark about the horrific events that transpired that night. My attempts to contact the police for information have been met with silence, as the investigation remains ongoing. All I know is that on that chilling night, I was just steps away from a house where 3 lives were forever altered.